There is a moment in human history so singular, so incomprehensible, that even now, more than 50 years later, people who were alive to witness it describe the same feeling. They sat in front of their television sets. Some were in living rooms, some were in bars, some huddled around a single screen with 30 other people in a village that had never seen a space rocket. And they watched, barely breathing, as a grainy black and white image flickered onto the screen. A ladder, a boot, and then a human being stepping off that ladder and onto the surface of the moon. 650 million people watched it happen. At that exact moment, July 20th, 1969, a man from a small town in Ohio became the first human being in the history of our species, in all 100,000 years of human existence on this earth, to stand on another world. And he said, in a voice as calm as if he were describing the weather, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." His name was Neil Alden Armstrong, and what most people do not know is that getting to that ladder, getting to that boot on that surface, required not just a rocket and not just a space program, but a lifetime of becoming. This is that story, from a farm in Ohio to the surface of the moon, from a boy who pressed his face against airplane magazines by flashlight, to the commander of the most extraordinary mission in human history. This is the story of a quiet man who did the loudest thing anyone has ever done. August 5th, 1930. Washington Township, Auglaize County, Ohio. A small farming community, the kind of place where neighbors know your name and the roads don't always have signs. Into this quiet corner of America, Neil Alden Armstrong was born, the first child of Stephen and Viola Armstrong. His father, Stephen, was an auditor for the Ohio state government, a steady, careful man whose job required him to move the family constantly. In the first 14 years of Neil's life, the Armstrongs lived in 16 different towns across Ohio. 16 towns. Different house, a different school, a different set of neighbors, over and over again. For most children, this kind of rootlessness is difficult. You never quite belong anywhere. You are always the new kid, always arriving, never fully settled. But Neil Armstrong had something that traveled with him to every new town, something that required no packing, no moving boxes, no new address. He had his love of flight. It had started almost from the beginning. When Neil was just 2 years old, barely old enough to walk steadily, his father took him to the Cleveland air races. Think about that. The year was 1932. Aviation was barely 29 years old. Airplanes were still extraordinary things, loud, dangerous, magnificent, that drew crowds the way nothing else could. And little Neil Armstrong looked up, and something in him clicked into place that never clicked back out. When he was 6, his father took him for his very first airplane ride, a Ford Trimotor, a big loud corrugated metal plane known affectionately as the Tin Goose. They flew over Warren, Ohio, the green fields spreading out below them, the horizon wider than he had ever seen it. And Neil Armstrong looked out the window and knew. He knew what he wanted. He was 6 years old. In the years that followed, as the family moved from town to town, Neil built model airplanes. He subscribed to aviation magazines. He read everything he could find about flight, about engines, about aerodynamics, about the science of how a metal machine could possibly be held up by something as invisible as air. And then, in the basement of the family home, he did something extraordinary for a child. He built a wind tunnel. By hand, with a fan, to test his model planes, to understand the forces that acted on them, to learn, not just to dream, but to actually understand the physics of flight. at an age when most children were playing with toy cars. This was Neil Armstrong at 10 years old. This was who he was, before any rocket, before any NASA, before any moon. In 1944, Neil was 13 years old when the family made its final move back to Wapakoneta, Ohio, the small town in Auglaize County where his story had begun. Wapakoneta was a town of about 6,000 people. It had a courthouse square, a five-and-dime, churches, a high school, and about 6 miles outside of town, the Auglaize County Airport, a small grass airstrip where a flight instructor named Aubrey Knudegard ran a small operation teaching people to fly. By the time Neil was 14, he had made his decision. He was going to take flying lessons. There was one problem. Flying lessons cost $9 an hour. $9 in 1944 was serious money, more than most people earned in a full day's work. Neil Armstrong's family was not poor, but they were not wealthy. His father's salary moved with each state posting, and there was certainly no money left over for a teenager to take flying lessons, so Neil Armstrong got a job. He swept floors at a local pharmacy. He stacked shelves. He did whatever was needed. He earned 40 cents an hour. Do the arithmetic. At 40 cents an hour, it took him 22.5 hours of work to pay for one single hour of flying. Every 3 weeks of sweeping and stacking, one lesson, and he did it. Month after month, Neil Armstrong bicycled to the Auglaize County Airport after school and on weekends, and he flew. Under the instruction of Aubrey Knudegard, he learned in an Aeronca 7AC Champion, a simple single-engine light aircraft, the kind of gentle machine that every real pilot learns to love because it has no electronics to hide behind, just you, the controls, and the air. And Neil Armstrong was good. Not just good, exceptional. He had a quality that the best pilots possess: an almost physical intelligence for flight, a feel for the machine that cannot be taught, only discovered. On August 5th, 1946, Neil Armstrong's 16th birthday, he received his student pilot's license before he had a driver's license. Before he had ever sat behind the wheel of a car, this 16-year-old boy from Wapakoneta, Ohio, was legally cleared to fly an airplane alone, and he did. He soloed the Aeronca over the flat Ohio farmland, the fields stretching out in all directions, the sky enormous and quiet above him, and somewhere up there, in that silence, he felt the thing that would drive every decision he made for the rest of his life. In 1947, Neil Armstrong graduated from Bloom High School in Wapakoneta. He had been accepted to Purdue University in Indiana, one of the finest aeronautical engineering programs in the country. But college was expensive, and the Armstrongs, as always, did not have unlimited funds. So Neil applied for and won a United States Navy scholarship under the Holloway Plan. The deal was simple and demanding. The Navy would pay his tuition in full for 2 years at Purdue. Then Neil would transfer to naval flight training, earn his wings, serve for a minimum of 3 years as a naval aviator, and then, if he chose, return to finish his degree. Neil Armstrong shook hands with that deal. He enrolled at Purdue in the fall of 1947, studying aeronautical engineering with total focus. He was fascinated not just by flying, but by the science behind it, the mathematics of lift and drag, the engineering of structures that could withstand the forces of high-speed flight. But the Navy's call came early. In 1949, with the Korean Peninsula growing more tense by the week, the Navy accelerated its program. Neil Armstrong was pulled from Purdue after just 3 semesters and sent to Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida for flight training. He earned his wings in August 1950. He was 20 years old, the youngest pilot in his squadron, and then Korea. The Korean War was not a clean or distant conflict. It was brutal, close-range aerial combat, fought at low altitude over mountains, rivers, and frozen paddy fields. Against enemy pilots who were well-trained and well-armed, Neil Armstrong flew 78 combat missions in a Grumman F-9F Panther jet fighter launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Essex. 78 missions. In each one, he rolled off that carrier deck at full throttle, dropped into the Korean sky, and flew toward targets that were defended by anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters. He flew over bridges, over supply depots, over rail lines running ammunition to the front, and on September 3, 1951, his luck nearly ran out. Armstrong was on a low-level mission near Maejin-ni, a narrow valley in North Korea, when his aircraft flew into a cable trap, a nearly invisible wire strung across a valley by enemy forces at low altitude to catch exactly this kind of low-flying jet. The cable caught his right wing. It sliced off roughly 6 feet of it, tearing the wing apart and sending the Panther into an immediate, barely controllable spin. Armstrong fought the controls. He managed to stabilize the jet enough to limp it south, away from enemy territory, coaxing the damaged aircraft toward friendly ground. He got as far as the South Korean coast, and then the aircraft was no longer flyable. He ejected. He yanked the ejection handle and was blasted out of the cockpit into the Korean sky, his body slamming with a force of 22 times his own weight in that single, explosive instant. The parachute opened. He drifted down, the wind carrying him, and landed, not in the sea as he had hoped, but flat on his back, in a muddy rice paddy. He stood up. He looked around, and there, driving toward him across the muddy field, was a Jeep, and behind the wheel was a face he recognized. A flight school classmate, a Marine lieutenant named Goodell Warren, who was stationed at a nearby airbase. Warren jumped out of the Jeep, looked at Armstrong, and said, "Armstrong, what the hell are you doing in my rice paddy?" Neil Armstrong, having just been shot down over North Korea, having ejected from a tumbling aircraft, having parachuted into enemy-adjacent territory, looked at his friend and laughed. That was Neil Armstrong. He flew 71 more missions after that day. He earned 3 air medals. He came home when the armistice was signed in 1953, 22 years old, a decorated combat veteran, and went back to Purdue to finish his degree. Neil Armstrong graduated from Purdue University in January 1955 with a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering. He immediately applied for a position as a research test pilot at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NAK, the agency that would become NASA just 3 years later. There was no opening at the high-speed flight station he wanted, at Edwards Air Force Base in California, so his application was forwarded to the NAKA's Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory in Cleveland, Ohio, and Armstrong started there in early 1955. Within months, a position opened at Edwards. And Neil Armstrong transferred to the place that was, at that moment in American history, the most extraordinary piece of real estate on Earth, Edwards Air Force Base. The Mojave Desert, California. In 1955, Edwards was the frontier of aviation. This was where Chuck Yeager had broken the sound barrier in 1947. This was where the most dangerous, most advanced, most technically demanding aircraft in the world were being flown by a small group of elite pilots who understood, every time they climbed into a cockpit, that the machine beneath them might be the death of them. Neil Armstrong fit in immediately, not because he was the most daring pilot, or the most aggressive, or the most headline-hungry. The opposite. Armstrong was known, even at Edwards, for his engineering mind. He didn't just fly the machines, he understood them. He could describe, in precise technical language, exactly what a plane was doing at every moment of a flight, which made him extraordinarily valuable as a research pilot. He flew over 200 different types of aircraft in his career. 200. Everything from early supersonic jet fighters, the F-100, F-101, F-102, F-104, to experimental rocket planes, to bomber variants, to prototype spacecraft. But the aircraft that defined his years at Edwards, the one that pushed him closest to space before space itself was the destination, was the North American X-15. The X-15 was not an airplane in any normal sense of the word. It was a black, rocket-powered bullet, 50 feet long, built to explore the very edge of the atmosphere, the place where air becomes so thin that aerodynamic surfaces stop working, and only rocket thrust keeps you from tumbling into the void. When the X-15 fired its engine, it accelerated to Mach 5.7, nearly 4,000 miles per hour. 6 times the speed of sound. It climbed to altitudes above 200,000 feet, 40 miles above the Earth, where the sky above the cockpit turns from blue to black, and you can see the curvature of the Earth below you. This was the edge of space, and Neil Armstrong flew there 7 times. On April 20th, 1962, his 6th X-15 flight, something went wrong. Armstrong was testing a new experimental control system, the MH-96 Adaptive Flight Controller. When he pulled the nose up during the descent and held it too long, the X-15 bounced. In the thin upper atmosphere, there is so little air that aerodynamic surfaces, wings, rudders, ailerons, have almost no effect. The plane stopped responding to conventional controls and literally skipped off the top of the atmosphere, like a stone skipping off water, and rocketed back up to 140,000 feet. Armstrong was now traveling at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, with almost no ability to steer, flying in the wrong direction, heading away from Edwards. He flew past the runway at Mach 3. 40 miles south of Edwards, still going far too fast, still too high. He waited. He managed the controls. He let the atmosphere thicken around him as he descended, and then, when the air was dense enough, he turned and landed. The longest X-15 flight in both time and distance ever recorded. Later, fellow astronaut Michael Collins wrote that among the X-15 pilots, Armstrong had been considered one of the weaker stick and rudder men, but the very best when it came to understanding the machine's design and how it operated. That was not an insult. That was a description of the exact quality that would save human life on the moon. In 1962, the United States was in the middle of a race, not just any race, the space race, against the Soviet Union, the most consequential technological competition in human history. In April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had become the first human being to travel to space, orbiting the Earth in a single loop and returning safely. America had been humiliated. And President John F. Kennedy, standing before a joint session of Congress in May 1961, had made one of the most audacious promises any leader in history had ever made. He told the American people that before the end of the decade, the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. No technology to do this existed. No rocket large enough had been built. No one had even orbited the moon, let alone landed on it, but Kennedy said it anyway. And the whole of NASA, every engineer, every mathematician, every astronaut, every welder, every seamstress sewing spacesuits, began building toward that single, impossible goal. And in September 1962, Neil Armstrong was selected as part of the second group of NASA astronauts, known as the New Nine. He was the first civilian, the first non-military pilot ever selected as an astronaut. He was 32 years old, and he had no idea, yet, that he would be the one to take the final step. March 16, 1966, Neil Armstrong sat in the commander's seat of the Gemini 8 capsule, a small narrow spacecraft barely large enough for 2 men, alongside astronaut David Scott. The mission objective was groundbreaking. Gemini 8 would attempt, for the very first time in history, to dock two spacecraft together while both were in orbit around the Earth. This was not a symbolic mission. Docking in orbit was an absolute requirement for the moon landing. Without the ability to join two spacecraft together in space, Apollo could not work. The entire program depended on perfecting this technique. Armstrong launched. He chased down the unmanned Agena target vehicle, a separate rocket that had been launched ahead of them, and with extraordinary precision, maneuvered the Gemini capsule until the two spacecraft kissed together and locked. First successful docking of two spacecraft in history. Done. And then, 30 minutes later, everything went wrong. One of Gemini's own thrusters, thruster number 8, had stuck in the open position. Unknown to Armstrong and Scott, it was firing continuously, spinning the two docked spacecraft into an uncontrolled roll. The roll accelerated. Both spacecraft, locked together, began spinning faster and faster, 1 revolution per second, then faster. Armstrong and Scott were being thrown against their harnesses, the world outside the window spinning in a nauseating blur, their vision beginning to gray at the edges from the G-forces. Armstrong made a split-second decision. He undocked from the Agena. It seemed like the right call. Remove the added weight of the Agena, regain control of Gemini alone. But the moment they undocked, the Gemini capsule, freed of the Agena's mass, spun even faster. The capsule was now rotating once per second, fast enough to cause incapacitation, fast enough to kill them if it got any worse. Armstrong, methodically, without panic, isolated the fault, identified thruster 8 as the culprit, and activated the re-entry control thrusters to counteract the spin. The rotation slowed. Stopped. They were alive. Armstrong had used so much of the re-entry thruster fuel to stop the spin that mission rules required them to terminate the mission immediately and return to Earth, which they did. The mission was cut short, but the men were alive. And those who watched Armstrong handle that crisis, who saw the cold, precise, unshakable calm with which he had diagnosed and solved a potentially fatal emergency in under 30 seconds, filed that away. They remembered. By 1968, the Apollo program had suffered a tragedy so devastating it nearly ended the entire moon effort. On January 27, 1967, during a routine ground test, a fire broke out inside the Apollo 1 capsule, killing all 3 astronauts inside. Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, 3 men, gone in a matter of seconds. On the launch pad, the program was suspended, redesigned, rebuilt, and when it returned with a seriousness and a precision that had not existed before. By late 1968, Apollo was flying again. Apollo 7, Apollo 8, Apollo 9, Apollo 10, each mission building on the last, proving systems, testing the lunar module, taking the crew to lunar orbit and back without landing. The landing itself, the real thing, was saved for Apollo 11. In January 1969, the crew of Apollo 11 was announced. Commander Neil Armstrong. Command Module Pilot Michael Collins. Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong was quiet when he heard the assignment. He did not celebrate. He did not give interviews. He did not make speeches. He went to work. For the next 6 months, the crew of Apollo 11 trained with an intensity that consumed every waking hour. Armstrong logged hundreds of hours in the Lunar Module Simulator, an exact replica of the spacecraft they would fly to the surface, practicing the landing over and over again in every possible failure scenario. Engine out. Computer alarm. Unexpected terrain. He practiced until the responses were not thought, but reflex, until his hands knew what to do before his mind had finished forming the instruction. He also trained in a device called the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, a strange, ungainly contraption that used a jet engine pointing straight down to simulate the moon's 1/6 gravity, while Armstrong used small thrusters to practice controlling his descent. In May 1969, during a training flight, the vehicle malfunctioned. Armstrong ejected less than 1 second before it crashed and exploded into a fireball on the ground below him. He went back to his office. He sat down. He continued working. A colleague found him there an hour later, doing paperwork, and asked if he was all right. Armstrong looked up and said, "Yes," and went back to his paperwork. The morning of July 16th, 1969, Cape Kennedy, Florida. It is not yet 9 o'clock in the morning, and the air is already thick with Florida heat. 1 million people have come. They line the beaches. They crowd the roadsides. They climb onto the roofs of cars and trucks and camper vans. Anything to get a better view. Former President Lyndon Johnson is there. Vice President Spiro Agnew is there. Senators, scientists, foreign dignitaries, and ordinary Americans, tens of thousands of them, who have driven from every corner of the country because they understand, in a way they cannot quite put into words, that this morning is different from all other mornings. The Saturn V rocket stands 363 feet tall on Launch Pad 39A. The largest, most powerful rocket ever built by human hands. It weighs 6 million pounds at launch. It generates 7.6 million pounds of thrust from its 5 first-stage engines, enough force to make the ground shake for miles, enough noise to be heard 50 miles away. At the very top of this machine, in a capsule barely larger than a small car, sit Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. They have been awake since 4:15 in the morning. They ate breakfast, steak and eggs, the traditional astronaut meal. They suited up. They rode the elevator to the top of the gantry. They climbed in, and they waited. At 9:32 in the morning, the countdown reached 0. The 5 engines ignited. The Saturn V, all 6 million pounds of it, shuddered and began to move. Slowly at first, agonizingly slowly. The crowd gasped, because for several seconds it seemed impossible that something so enormous could actually rise, but it did. It rose, gathering speed, the thunder rolling out across the Florida coast in waves, shaking bones, rattling windows, and 1 million people watched and screamed and cried and waved as Apollo 11 climbed into the blue morning sky, faster and faster, until it was a point of light, and then a contrail, and then nothing at all. Neil Armstrong was on his way to the moon. The journey took 4 days, 240,000 miles, across the void of space, in a spacecraft the size of a modest apartment. 3 days in, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit. The moon filled the windows. Not the moon as seen from Earth, distant and romantic and softly glowing. This was the moon up close. Gray, scarred, ancient, pocked with craters beyond counting, some the size of cities. Their edges sharp and shadowless, because there is no atmosphere to soften them, no wind, no rain, no weather of any kind. It was magnificent and completely hostile to human life. On July 20th, 1969, Armstrong and Aldrin crawled through the tunnel connecting the command module to the lunar module, a spindly gold foil-wrapped spacecraft they had named Eagle, while Collins remained alone in the command module, Columbia, the hatch sealed behind them. "The Eagle has wings," Armstrong called to Mission Control. An Eagle separated from Columbia and began its descent toward the surface of the moon. What happened in the next 12 minutes? is one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in human history. Eagle was descending toward the Sea of Tranquility, a broad, relatively flat region on the moon's near side, chosen for the first landing because it was the safest-looking option from the photographs. At 33,000 feet above the surface, a computer alarm went off, a code 1202 that neither Armstrong nor Aldrin had ever seen during any training simulation. Their stomachs dropped. They called Mission Control. In Houston, a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales had roughly 4 seconds to decide whether this alarm was a mission-ending emergency or something the crew could fly through. He decided, go. They continued. The alarm sounded again. Again. Go. The alarm was the computer telling them it was overloaded, but it had been programmed to restart and prioritize the most critical tasks. It was working, but it was stressed. 5 more alarms sounded on the way down. Each time, go. And then, at 3,000 feet above the surface, Armstrong looked out the window, and his heart rate, already high, spiked further. The computer was guiding them toward a crater. West Crater, 180 meters across, 30 meters deep, its rim jagged with boulders the size of houses. If they landed there, the mission was over. The lunar module would tip. They would never get off the surface. Armstrong took manual control. With one hand on the attitude controller, with the other managing the thrust, he flew Eagle over the crater, searching the terrain beyond it for a safe place to land. The fuel gauge was counting down. In Houston, a voice called out, 60 seconds. 60 seconds of fuel remaining before they would be legally required to abort, to fire the ascent engine and climb back to Collins in Columbia, and come home without landing. Armstrong kept flying. He spotted a clear patch beyond a second, smaller crater. 30 seconds. He brought Eagle down, slowly, watching the dust begin to blow outward as the engine thrust hit the surface. A ghostly spray of fine gray particles streaming away in all directions, because on the moon, with no air, the dust traveled in perfect flat sheets. He could see the shadow of Eagle's landing legs on the gray surface below, and then a blue light illuminated on the instrument panel. A contact probe, one of the thin metal rods extending below Eagle's landing pads, had touched the lunar surface. Aldrin called it out immediately. Contact light! Armstrong cut the engine. Eagle settled. And there was a moment, just a moment, of complete, total silence. Then Armstrong spoke, in that same calm voice, the voice of a man who had just manually landed a spacecraft on the moon with 20 seconds of fuel remaining. The voice of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. In Mission Control, grown men wept. They hugged each other. Someone grabbed a slide rule they had been gripping for the last 12 minutes and threw it in the air. Flight Director Gene Kranz, who had kept his voice steady through every alarm, every crisis, took off his headset and put his head in his hands. And around the world, 650 million people, watching on televisions in living rooms, in bars and soirees in village squares, heard those words and understood that something had changed. That the world was now different from what it had been 30 seconds ago. They were supposed to rest for 6 hours before going outside. Armstrong and Aldrin could not sleep. They checked Eagle's systems. They verified the landing. They made sure the ascent engine, the only way off the moon, was functional. And then they suited up At 10:56 in the evening, Houston time, on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong climbed down Eagle's ladder. He paused on the last rung, below his boot, the lunar surface. Fine gray dust. Ancient rock. Not touched by anything, not shaped by water or wind or life for billions of years. He stepped off. Said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." 650 million people heard it. A boy from a small town in Ohio who had swept pharmacy floors for 40 cents an hour to pay for flying lessons, who had been shot down over Korea and parachuted into a rice paddy, who had bounced off the atmosphere at Mach 3 in a rocket plane, who had spun out of control in orbit, who had trained for 2 years for a 12-minute landing, was standing on the moon. The surface was firm beneath his boots, covered in a fine gray powder that compressed slightly when he stepped, like damp sand. He could see his footprints clearly. He described it to Mission Control in the careful, precise language of an engineer who knew that every observation was valuable, who understood that he was the eyes and ears of science at that moment. The first field reporter from another world. "The surface is fine and powdery. I can pick it up loosely with my toe. It does adhere in fine layers like powdered charcoal to the sole and sides of my boots." Buzz Aldrin joined him 19 minutes later. Together, in the pale, shadowless light of a lunar morning, they planted an American flag. They collected rock samples, 21 kilograms of lunar material that scientists would study for decades. They set up scientific instruments. They spoke briefly with President Richard Nixon, who called it, and he was right, the most historic phone call ever made from the White House. They were on the surface for 2 hours and 31 minutes. 2 hours and 31 minutes. That represented 10,000 years of human dreaming about flight, about the stars, about what lay beyond the horizon, about whether we were truly capable of doing the impossible. They climbed back up the ladder. They sealed the hatch. They slept on the surface of the moon, Aldrin on the floor, Armstrong perched above him on the engine cowling, improvising a hammock to hold his legs, the cabin temperature having dropped to 61 degrees Fahrenheit. They slept on the moon. At 1:54 in the afternoon on July 21st, Eagle's ascent engine fired, the single most terrifying moment of the entire mission. This engine had only one chance. There was no backup. If it failed to ignite, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the moon, with no possibility of rescue with only a few hours of oxygen remaining. It fired. Eagle rose from the Sea of Tranquility, leaving behind the descent stage, and the American flag, and a plaque bolted to one of the landing legs that read, in words that Armstrong himself had helped choose, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." They rose through the black lunar sky, no atmosphere, no clouds, just stars, and found Michael Collins waiting in Columbia above them. They docked. Armstrong and Aldrin crawled back through the tunnel. Collins, who had been orbiting alone, who had been on the far side of the moon, completely cut off from all communication for portions of his solo vigil, looked at his crewmates and felt something he described as a profound satisfaction. They jettisoned Eagle into lunar orbit and fired the engine for home. 4 days later, July 24th, 1969, the command module Columbia splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, southwest of Hawaii. USS Hornet recovered them. And the world, which had held its breath for 8 days and 3 hours, exhaled. What happened next tells you everything about Neil Armstrong. And the world wanted a hero. Parades, speeches, television appearances, book deals, magazine covers, and Armstrong gave them the parade, the Goodwill World Tour, the presidential medals, the congressional appearances. But as soon as he reasonably could, he stepped back. He resigned from NASA in 1971. He moved to a farm in Lebanon, Ohio. He became a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati, teaching students who were not yet born when he walked on the moon, speaking about fluid dynamics and aeronautical engineering, refusing to lecture about Apollo unless directly asked. He stopped giving autographs in 1994 after discovering that signed memorabilia was being sold for enormous sums online. He donated the legal settlements from those who misused his name to charity. He lived quietly. He farmed. He played baritone horn, the same instrument he had played in the Purdue marching band as a student. He sat on corporate boards. He served on government commissions investigating the Challenger disaster. He gave one remarkable interview to a group of accountants who had been persistent enough to reach him because, he said, he liked accountants. He was famously, stubbornly private, not because he was ashamed of what he had done, but because he was genuinely, honestly, a man who did not believe that what he had accomplished belonged to him alone. He said it many times in many different ways. That Apollo 11 was the work of 400,000 people, engineers and mathematicians and machinists and seamstresses and flight controllers and flight surgeons. That he was the one who happened to be in the commander's seat. And that was largely a matter of sequence and circumstance and the judgment of others, not of his own choosing or his own greatness. He meant it. He genuinely meant it. Neil Armstrong died on August 25, 2012. He was 82 years old. Complications following heart surgery. His family released a statement, and the words they chose were not about the moon. They were about the man. They said, "For those who may ask what they can do to honor Neil, we have a simple request. Honor his example of service, accomplishment, and modesty. And the next time you walk outside on a clear night and see the moon smiling down at you, think of Neil Armstrong and give him a wink. Give him a wink." That is who this man was. Not a monument, not a statue, not a brand. A man who swept pharmacy floors to pay for flying lessons, who ejected over a Korean rice paddy and then flew 71 more missions, who bounced off the atmosphere at Mach 3 and landed anyway, who spun out of control in orbit and fixed it with 30 seconds of pure cold engineering, who trained for 2 years, then flew a manual landing with 20 seconds of fuel remaining, on a world no human being had ever touched, who came home and went back to Ohio and tried to be ordinary again. He never quite managed ordinary because of course he didn't. You cannot walk on the moon and be ordinary. But he tried, and I think that is more inspiring, not less, than the moon landing itself. Because here is what Neil Armstrong's life is actually telling you when you look at all of it, from the boy with the wind tunnel in the basement of a rented house in Ohio, to the man leaving a footprint in the dust of the Sea of Tranquility. It is not telling you that greatness is reserved for the exceptional. It is telling you that greatness is built. Lesson by lesson. Flight by flight. Failure by failure. Crisis by crisis. Neil Armstrong did not walk on the moon because he was born with something the rest of us don't have. He walked on the moon because he spent a lifetime, from the age of 6, showing up, learning, practicing, staying calm when the world was spinning out of control, going back to work the day after the training vehicle exploded beneath him, trusting the preparation when the alarms were going off and the fuel was counting down and the boulders were in the way. That is not a story about one man going to the moon. That is a story about what every human being is capable of when they decide early what they are for and then spend a lifetime becoming it. The moon is still up there. His footprint is still there, preserved in the lunar dust, because there is no wind on the moon, no rain, no erosion. It will be there for millions of years, long after every person alive today is gone, long after the countries that competed in the space race have changed beyond recognition, long after the names of most presidents and generals and billionaires are forgotten. That footprint will still be there, Neil Armstrong's footprint. The first, quietly pressed into the dust of another world by a quiet man from a small town in Ohio who swept pharmacy floors and never stopped looking up. If this story moved you today, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it. A young person who has been told their dreams are too big. A friend who has been knocked down too many times. A version of yourself that has started to believe the ceiling is real. Neil Armstrong's story is the proof that it isn't. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this, because we are just getting started. The next story is already waiting. And until then, look up.